What happens when a powerful billionaire biker dares to challenge a quiet, single-dad veteran in front of an entire room, only to discover that true strength has nothing to do with money or muscle? This is not just a story about fists or pride. It's about respect, redemption, and the kind of quiet courage that can shake the world. If stories like this inspire you, filled with heart, justice, and hope, don't forget to subscribe to Soul Moments Story. Your support helps us share more unforgettable journeys like this one. The sound of boots striking the mat cracked through the air like a whip, pulling every pair of eyes toward the woman at the center of the gym. Valeria Cross, Billionaire. Biker queen, notorious for her arrogance and feared even by her own crew, stood with her leather jacket hanging open, revealing a body carved by years of street fights and extreme training. Her blonde hair, braided with steel beads, glittered under the fluorescent lights as she smirked. She pointed across the mat, her voice slicing the tense air. "The janitor, I challenge you. Let's see where you really belong." A ripple of laughter broke out among the bikers gathered around. Their roaring jeers bounced off the walls, mixing with the pounding bass of the rock music still playing from the speakers. To them, this was entertainment, a spectacle where the powerful humiliate the invisible. Across the room, Marcus Hale paused in silence. His calloused hands tightened slightly around the wooden mop handle he had been using to scrub sweat stains from the corner. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his long hair tied loosely at the nape of his neck. His janitor's apron looked oddly mismatched with the faded olive-green shirt of an old U.S. Navy uniform. Beneath it, its fabric worn thin from years of use. He did not move. The laughter swelled. "Come on, old man," someone shouted. "Show her how to clean the floor with your face." But Marcus's eyes, dark and steady, lifted only for a moment toward Valeria. They were not angry. They were not afraid. They carried the calm of someone who had seen storms far greater than this. Then his gaze dropped again back to the bucket, as if the billionaire's insult hadn't even touched him. The crowd jeered louder. Valeria stepped closer, her heavy biker boots thudding against the mat. She tilted her head, mocking. "What's wrong? Too scared? Or do you only know how to fight dirt on the floor?" Behind Marcus, a small voice rose, a child's voice, clear and unshaken. Emily Hale, just 8 years old, stood by the doorway, with her backpack still slung over one shoulder. She had come straight from school, as she always did, waiting patiently for her father to finish his evening cleaning shift. Her brown eyes shone with something stronger than fear-belief. "Daddy," she said softly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "You don't have to prove anything. But if you do, I know you'll win." The room shifted. Some laughed at the little girl's boldness. Others grew uncomfortably quiet, sensing the purity of a child's faith clashing with the cruelty of adult mockery. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. He had spent years teaching his daughter that silence was often stronger than shouting, that walking away could sometimes be braver than staying. But now her gaze was on him, steady, proud, waiting, and that gaze called him to rise. He set the mop back into the bucket with deliberate calm. The sound of wood against metal was almost ceremonial. Then he straightened the years of military discipline woven into the quiet way he moved. He walked toward the mat. Each step was unhurried, yet the laughter dimmed, as if an invisible weight had pressed down on the room. Valeria smirked, misreading his composure as hesitation. "Good. Finally, the janitor shows some backbone. Don't worry, I'll make it quick. My crew needs a demonstration anyway, so they know the hierarchy around here." Marcus stepped onto the mat. He stood tall, not towering, but grounded like a rooted oak. His eyes met Valeria's for the first time, without breaking away. For a split second, she felt something sharp, something unexplainable, flicker in the silence between them, an undercurrent of power not yet revealed. And then he spoke, his voice calm, even resonant. "I'll spar with you, but if I win, you will apologize. Not to me." He gestured toward the onlookers, toward the janitors, the trainers, the workers who cleaned and repaired the gym, but to everyone you've ever mocked for being beneath you. The room froze. The laughter stopped cold. Valeria blinked, her smirk faltering for the first time. Around her, the bikers exchanged glances. The crowd wasn't laughing anymore. What was supposed to be a cruel joke had transformed into something else, a wager that carried the weight of justice. Emily's small hand clenched the strap of her backpack. A smile spread across her face, full of quiet pride. Marcus's final words cut through the silence like a blade. "That is my condition. If I win, you will show them respect." The bucket of dirty water rippled where he had set the mop. The air in the gym grew thick with anticipation, every witness holding their breath. For the first time, Valeria felt the challenge shift, not just a fight of fists, but of dignity, of something she had never truly faced before. And so it began. The gym was still buzzing with restless energy long after Marcus had stepped off the mat. Whispers rippled through the room like a current. Who is he? Where did he come from? The janitor with the quiet eyes had just shifted the air in a way no one expected. And though he had not yet thrown a single strike, something about him carried the weight of a storm waiting to break. Marcus walked away without a word, his boots soft against the polished floor. Emily trotted quickly beside him, her small hand brushing his sleeve. The mop and bucket were left behind, forgotten relics of the life everyone assumed defined him. He pushed open the side door that led to the narrow alley, letting the cool California evening spill over them. The roar of engines from parked Harleys outside filled the silence. Marcus inhaled deeply, the scent of oil and asphalt mixing with the faint sweetness of orange blossoms drifting in from the street. His face remained unreadable, but inside him old shadows stirred. The sight of Valeria's mocking grin had stirred something buried. Something Marcus had worked years to bury beneath routine and silence. As he leaned against the brick wall, his eyes closed for just a moment. And then the desert came rushing back. The Middle East, a sky so wide it seemed endless, seared by a merciless sun. The deafening crack of gunfire ricocheting through dust-choked air. Marcus, clad in combat gear, pressing his shoulder against a crumbling wall as explosions painted the horizon orange. He remembered the voice of Sergeant Cole, steady, reassuring yelling above the chaos. "We hold this line, Hale. No one gets past us." Cole, his closest friend, his brother in every way except blood. They had shared foxholes, and secrets talked about their kids promised to keep each other alive. But promises had a cruel way of breaking. Marcus saw it again. The flash, the spray of debris, the impossible stillness that followed. He had reached Cole's side too late, dragging him behind cover, pressing his hands desperately against wounds no hand could stop. Cole's last breath had been a whisper, almost drowned out by the storm of war. "Take care of them, Hale. Take care," and then silence. The desert faded, replaced by the alley's dim light, but the weight of it lingered, as it always did. That was his hero's wound, a loss that never healed, that carved him into the man who now walked quietly through life, raising his daughter in the shadow of sacrifices no one else saw. Daddy Emily's voice pulled him back, soft but insistent. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and searching. "Why does she hate you? Why does that lady act like that?" Marcus crouched down so they were eye to eye. For a moment he just studied her face, the small freckles across her nose, the unshakable trust in her gaze. She was the reason he kept moving, the reason he woke up before dawn and worked jobs others looked down on. He brushed a strand of hair from her cheek and answered gently, his voice carrying the weight of years of lived truth. People often hate what they don't understand. Sometimes they laugh at it. Sometimes they try to break it. But that hate, it isn't about us, Emily. It's about them. Her little brow furrowed, considering his words as though she was older than her years. So, it's not really about you. Marcus shook his head slowly. No, it's about their own fear, their own emptiness. Remember this, sweetheart, we can't control how others see us. We can only control who we choose to be. Emily nodded, though a faint tremor lingered in her lips. She was still a child, still trying to understand why the world sometimes spat on kindness and humility. But his calm reassured her, as it always did. From the corner of the gym, just beyond the glass door, a young woman watched them. Lena Torres, one of the assistant trainers, had lingered when the others scattered. She had seen countless sparring matches in her life, fighters desperate to prove their worth, rookies eager to show off in front of veterans. But what she had seen tonight was different. Marcus hadn't moved like a man afraid. He had moved like a man choosing restraint. Every shift of his stance, every pause before stepping onto the mat, it spoke of someone who understood violence intimately, yet carried it like a locked blade he refused to draw unless necessary. Lena crossed her arms, her sharp eyes narrowing. Something about him unsettled her, not in fear, but in curiosity. People didn't just become that calm under fire. That kind of composure came from years of facing storms. Most could not survive. She recalled the way Emily had spoken up, clear, unafraid, as if she already knew her father's quiet power. It wasn't bravado. It was certainty. And certainty like that was never built on nothing. Lena's instincts, honed from years of coaching fighters, whispered to her, "He isn't just a janitor." Marcus rose from his crouch, slipping his arm gently around Emily's shoulders. Together they walked down the alley, the hum of motorcycles fading behind them. He carried himself like a man immune to humiliation, though inside ghosts pressed heavy against his chest. He did not look back at the gym, but others did, students whispering, bikers, glancing uneasily at one another. For the first time, the legend of Valeria Cross's dominance had been cracked not by brute force, but by a man who barely spoke. Inside the gym, Lena Torres finally stepped forward, her hand resting lightly against the glass door. Her gaze followed Marcus into the night, her mind already turning. Who was he really? Why was a man who carried himself like a soldier, who looked at the world with the calm of someone who had endured fire, mopping sweat off a floor for minimum wage, and more importantly, what would happen when the truth could no longer stay hidden? Marcus did not hear her questions. All he heard was Emily's small voice beside him, still echoing in the quiet alley, "Daddy, I believe in you." He tightened his arm around her shoulder and walked on the past, whispering behind him, the future waiting just ahead. The following evening, the gym hummed with restless anticipation. Word had already spread like wildfire through the biker community. Valeria Cross, the billionaire who owned half the block and rode her Harley like a warhorse, had been publicly challenged by a janitor. It was unthinkable and irresistible. People came to see what would happen next. Valeria arrived as if the whole spectacle had been staged for her grand entrance. Her custom black and chrome Harley roared into the parking lot, the engine shaking the glass panes of the gym. She swung her leg over the seat, tossing her blonde braids back with theatrical defiance. Behind her, A convoy of leather-clad bikers spilled out their presence, a mix of intimidation and carnival. Inside, the students had already lined the mats. Some were eager for the show, others hesitant, but unable to look away. The witness effect was in full force, an audience assembled not just to watch, but to judge, to remember, and to whisper afterward. Valeria strode onto the mat with boots clicking like gunshots. She wore her wealth like armor rings of platinum, a leather vest custom-stitched with gold thread, her aura screaming power and entitlement. She let her gaze sweep the room before landing squarely on Marcus Hale. He was there as always in his faded uniform shirt and janitor's apron, pushing his mop along the floor with steady, unhurried movements. He didn't look up. To him, the stains on the mat were more deserving of attention than the billionaire demanding a spotlight. Valeria smirked, spreading her arms as if to display herself. "Ladies and gentlemen, here's the man of the hour." The war hero turned janitor, the invisible custodian who thinks he can stand on my mat. "Tell me, Marcus, do you polish floors because you're too afraid to fight on them?" Laughter erupted across the gym. Some students laughed nervously, others too loudly, trying to mask their discomfort. The bikers howled, slapping each other's shoulders, reveling in the cruelty. Marcus kept his eyes down, shoulders steady. He had endured far worse than ridicule in desert foxholes half a world away. He had no need to defend himself with words. But the scene played out in front of his daughter, and that was a different matter. Emily, who had been sitting on a bench near the wall with her sketchbook balanced on her knees, slowly closed it. She slid off the bench, her small shoes padding against the mat as she stepped forward. At 8 years old, she was dwarfed by the crowd around her. But her presence silenced more than the jeers of the audience. Her voice rang clear and unwavering, cutting through the laughter like a blade. "Money doesn't make you stronger than my dad." The words hit like a thunderclap. The laughter faltered. Students glanced at one another. The bikers' grins stiffened. Even Valeria blinked, taken aback for a fraction of a second. Emily's eyes, large and fierce, locked on Valeria. Her chin lifted, her voice steady, despite the tension pressing down on the room. "You can buy bikes. You can buy gyms. You can even buy people's fear. But you can't buy what he has. You can't buy respect. You can't buy honor." The silence that followed was electric. The witness effect deepened. Every person in that gym became a participant forced to confront the raw truth spoken, not by a fighter, not by a veteran, but by a child. Valeria's lips curled, her pride stung by the challenge of someone so small. "Cute," she sneered, though her voice carried a tremor she didn't expect. "Your daddy put those words in your mouth." Emily shook her head. Her voice was almost soft now, but it carried further than any shout. "No, I see it every day. He doesn't need to say it. He lives it." Marcus finally looked up. His eyes met his daughter's for a moment, shone at gratitude, silent pride. He hadn't asked her to defend him, but Emily had inherited his unshakable core, the quiet defiance of someone who knew dignity was not negotiable. Valeria scoffed, trying to gather her composure. She turned to the audience. "Look at this. The janitor hides behind a little girl now. Is this what passes for strength?" But no one laughed. Not this time. The echo of Emily's words lingered heavier than Valeria's mockery. A young student near the front shifted uncomfortably. Another glanced down at the floor, ashamed. For the first time, Valeria's dominance began to crack, not through fists or money, but through the undeniable truth spoken by a child who believed in her father. Lena Torres, standing in the back, felt her chest tighten. She had coached dozens of fighters, studied psychology of strength and weakness, but this This was something no training could simulate. A child holding a mirror up to arrogance. A daughter proving to the world what kind of man her father was without him needing to say a word. Valeria's jaw clenched. She could feel the weight of the witnesses, their shifting loyalty, their silent judgment. And that terrified her more than any punch ever could. Emily took one small step back toward her father, sliding her hand into his. The gesture was simple, but it carried the force of a declaration. Marcus squeezed, gently grounding her, telling her without words that she had already done enough. The crowd remained hushed, their earlier laughter, now a ghost lingering awkwardly in the air. Valeria forced a laugh, hollow and sharp, trying to claw back control. "Fine. If respect is what you want, janitor, then step up again. Show them all. Let's see if you can stand against me when I'm serious." But her voice rang less like triumph and more like desperation. Everyone in that gym had heard Emily's words, and everyone knew the truth, no matter what came next. Something fundamental had already shifted. The room stood suspended in silence, every witness carrying the weight of the moment. The mat had never felt so heavy with silence. For once, even Valeria's entourage of bikers stopped jeering, their grins stiffening as anticipation thickened the air. Everyone in that gym could sense that this was no longer just a spectacle. It was becoming something else, something raw and dangerous, though no one could yet name it. Valeria cracked her neck, her eyes glinting with predatory fire. She had fought in underground biker rings for years, a street brawler who relished proving herself in front of her crew. That confidence blazed in her every step as she circled Marcus. Marcus stood still at the center of the mat. He didn't raise his fists. He didn't shift into a fighting stance. His arms hung relaxed at his sides, his posture almost disarmingly calm. To the untrained eye, he looked like a man waiting for a bus, not facing down a billionaire with something to prove. Valeria sneered at his stillness. "This won't take long," she hissed. Then she exploded forward. Her boot cut through the air in a wide arc, a kick powered by the raw muscle of a woman who had thrown down men twice her size. The sound of her leather sole slicing toward Marcus cracked through the silence. Marcus moved at the last possible moment. Not with a dramatic leap or a desperate block, just a subtle shift, a single step that carried the grace of water flowing around stone. Her kick sliced through empty space. The impact never came. Gasps broke from the crowd. Valeria stumbled, her balance thrown off by the sheer emptiness where she had expected resistance. Marcus remained motionless, eyes calm, his breathing steady. He had not even raised his hands. Valeria growled, teeth bared. She spun, launching a second attack, fists snapping forward in a combination drilled through years of street fight instinct. A jab across, another jab. Each strike was fast, vicious enough to rattle the jaw of any rookie foolish enough to take her on. Each time Marcus shifted just inches. His body seemed to predict her movements before they happened, as if her strikes were echoes he had already heard. Her fists sliced air, grazing fabric but never flesh. The onlookers leaned forward, their voices hushed now, disbelief seeping into their faces. The jeering had turned to murmurs, then to silence. "Is he dodging on purpose?" someone whispered. Marcus's eyes never left Valeria's. They weren't taunting or angry. They were simply present, as though he was studying her not as an opponent, but as a storm he had weathered before. Every motion of his feet was measured, every angle of his body chosen not to retaliate, but to avoid. The power shift began to take hold. The crowd, once fully in Valeria's corner, began to sense it, an imbalance, a truth leaking through the spectacle. This man wasn't flinching. He wasn't scrambling. He was controlling the rhythm without lifting a finger. Valeria felt the change too, though she refused to name it. Sweat beaded on her brow. Anger coursed through her veins. How dare this janitor make her look clumsy in front of her people, she roared, throwing herself forward with reckless force. Her boot crashed against the mat as she lunged for a tackle, aiming to bring him down by sheer weight. But Marcus shifted again, letting her own momentum betray her. She collided with empty air and stumbled. Her foot slid against the mat, her body lurching forward awkwardly. She tried to recover, but for the first time her balance betrayed her. The room gasped as Valeria staggered, her arms flailing slightly, the controlled power of the biker queen unraveling into something raw and unsteady. Marcus did nothing. He didn't strike. He didn't press the advantage. He simply watched her, his breathing, even his body rooted like an oak that had stood against storms before. Valeria caught herself just before falling. She steadied her feet, chest-heaving fury burning her cheeks red. Yet the silence around her told her more than any blow. The witnesses were seeing her differently now. Emily's voice rang out from the sidelines, small but clear, piercing through the charged silence. Daddy doesn't have to fight you. He just has to show you what respect looks like. The words stung sharper than any strike. Valeria's jaw tightened, her pride screaming in her chest. She had wanted a spectacle, a humiliation of the janitor. Instead, she was the one staggering under the weight of invisible blows. His restraint, his calm, his daughter's faith. Lena Torres, standing near the back, felt her heart race. She had trained athletes for years, but she recognized something here. She rarely saw mastery hidden beneath humility. This wasn't luck. It wasn't coincidence. Marcus was dismantling Valeria without ever lifting a hand. Valeria spat on the mat, glaring at Marcus. "Fight me," she demanded, her voice cracking with frustration. Marcus's reply was soft, but it carried to every corner of the gym. "I already am." The line hung in the air like a verdict, and in that moment, everyone in the room knew the truth. This was not a janitor. This was not a man clinging to the shadows of insignificance. This was someone else entirely. Someone dangerous. Someone extraordinary. Valeria's pride burned hot, but her balance wavered again as she charged her fury, blinding her control. She stumbled, her knee nearly giving out. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the billionaire biker queen, so often untouchable, teetered on the edge of collapse. The clash had begun, but the outcome was already whispering itself into the silence of the witnesses. Marcus hadn't thrown a single punch. And yet the room was no longer hers. Valeria steadied herself, her chest heaving as though she had just climbed a mountain. The smirk that usually clung to her lips had slipped away, leaving only the thin line of frustration and disbelief. She had thrown Ibwa and everything at him, speed, strength, aggression, and yet Marcus Hale hadn't even raised a fist. The silence in the gym was louder than any roar. Every witness, from bikers in leather vests to young students in training gear, felt it pressing against their ears. What had started as a spectacle was unraveling into something entirely different, something they would never forget. Marcus stood across from Valeria, his stance unchanged. No sweat glistened on his brow. No ragged breaths tore from his chest. He was calm, steady, grounded like a man standing against a storm that could not move him. He could have struck her when she faltered. He could have ended it in an instant. But he hadn't. Instead, he spoke. His voice carried like a low-tide calm, but filling every corner of the room. Real strength is quiet until it's needed. The words slid into the silence and hung there, unshakable. The crowd shifted their heads, turning toward him, then toward one another. There was no bravado in his tone, no need to shout, or declare victory. It was a truth spoken simply like something carved into stone long before this night. From the sideline, Emily's small voice rose, echoing her father's words with innocent conviction. Real strength is quiet until it's needed. Her voice trembled slightly at the edges, but its clarity carried further than any microphone could. In that moment, the echo of a child's faith struck deeper than any punch. Gasps rippled through the room. A young student at the front pressed her hand to her chest. A biker lowered his arms suddenly, unsure of his laughter. Even those loyal to Valeria found their throats tight. The innocence of the echo made the truth undeniable. Valeria's face darkened, humiliation seeping into her pride. Her jaw clenched, her eyes narrowing into daggers. To her, Marcus's restraint was not mercy, but mockery. By refusing to finish her, he had shown her up in front of everyone. "You think this is funny?" She spat, her voice shaking with fury. "You think standing there letting me miss makes you better than me?" Marcus didn't reply. He simply breathed, his silence sharper than any insult. Valeria's fists balled. The billionaire who had built an empire on intimidation now stood trembling in front of a man who refused to play her game. Her ego screamed at her to lash out again, but a part of her, buried and unacknowledged, whispered what she could not admit: she was losing not because of his power, but because of his control. Near the back of the gym, Lena Torres's eyes narrowed with something more than curiosity now. Her instincts as a coach had been screaming since the first dodge, but this was something else. She slipped her phone from her pocket, fingers moving quickly across the screen. "Marcus Hale," she murmured under her breath as she typed. The search results loaded, and her heart gave a small jolt. Headlines, old photos, grainy shots of a younger man in military fatigues, his hair shorter, but his eyes unmistakable. Beneath the headlines, a name repeated again and again: Iron Will Hale. Her eyes widened as she scrolled. Articles about a Navy SEAL who had earned a reputation for impossible endurance, a man who had survived missions that broke others, a soldier who disappeared from the public eye after a classified operation went wrong in the Middle East. Lena looked up at the man standing calmly on the mat, the janitor who had just dismantled a billionaire without striking a single blow. The pieces began to connect. He isn't hiding weakness, she thought. He's hiding history. Valeria's voice dragged Lena back to the present. "Stand there all you like," Valeria snarled, her voice thick with anger. "But don't you dare humiliate me." Marcus's eyes met hers, then dark, unwavering. There was no malice, no gloating, only the stillness of a man who knew the weight of restraint. "You humiliate yourself," he said softly, but his words cut sharper than a blade. The crowd shifted again. Some students looked down at the mat, ashamed of the laughter they had offered earlier. The bikers shuffled uncomfortably, sensing the unraveling of the power dynamic they had always taken for granted. Emily's small hand pressed against her chest as she looked at her father. She wasn't smiling. Her eyes were damp, shimmering with the weight of knowing. To her, this wasn't just about winning a spar. It was about showing the world the man she saw every day. The man who made her sandwiches before school, who read her stories at night, who carried the silence of old battles so she wouldn't have to. Her voice trembled, but rose again, brave as ever. "He's not humiliating you. He's teaching you." The room froze. Valeria's lips parted, her fury colliding with the sting of truth. The words of a child, gentle, unarmed, but impossible to dismiss, had struck where fists could not. For Lena, the sight was unforgettable. She watched Marcus, saw Emily's unwavering faith, and felt the chill of realization spread through her chest. The janitor was not just some invisible worker. He was a man who had chosen obscurity, carrying scars the world had forgotten. And now, in the most unlikely of places, he was teaching them all what strength really meant. Her phone screen dimmed, but the name lingered in her mind. Iron Will Hale. Valeria clenched her fists, trembling with the weight of shame and pride colliding inside her. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to reclaim the room. But the silence was crushing her. The witnesses were judging her, and the little girl's words echoed louder than her own voice ever could. Emily's echo remained in the air, etched into every witness. Real strength is quiet, until it's needed. And in that silence, Valeria Cross, Lady Biker Billionaire, felt something she had not felt in years. The sting of defeat. Not of her body, but of her pride. The echo of fists meeting leather still lingered in the gym. The crowd of bikers trainees and curious spectators was dispersing, their conversations hushed. But Valeria Cross lingered in the corner. She leaned against the wall, her leather jacket tossed carelessly over a bench, her sharp profile lit by the humming fluorescent lights above. Her fists were clenched so tight her knuckles had turned white. To everyone else, she was the Lady Biker Billionaire, the queen who ruled both boardrooms and back alleys, a figure untouchable, feared, and admired. But beneath that iron mask, the woman was bleeding in places unseen. She replayed the moment again and again, Marcus's calm evasion, the way he had dismantled her assault without striking back. And that maddening line of his real strength is quiet, until it's needed. The words echoed like a bell inside her chest, colliding with memories she had buried deep. Years earlier, Valeria had been different. Not the feared biker queen, not the billionaire whose empire spread from oil rigs to luxury brands. She had been a young heiress, eager, romantic, foolish enough to believe in loyalty. And then betrayal came. The man she trusted most, her fiancé. A polished executive had taken her company's secrets, sold them, and left her standing in courtrooms humiliated before the press. He had called her a spoiled girl who thought she was strong. The tabloids had feasted on her tears. From that day forward, Valeria had vowed never again to be seen as weak. She built her biker crew not just for adrenaline, but as a shield, an army of rough men and women who bowed to her authority, who never questioned her fists or her money. Her muscles, her wealth, her tattoos, all of it became armor against a world eager to laugh at a broken woman. But tonight, in front of strangers, Marcus Hale had stripped that armor bare. Not with force, not with cruelty, simply with restraint, with humility, with that maddening refusal to meet violence with violence. It infuriated her, and it terrified her. Emily's small voice drifted back into Valeria's memory, too. Money doesn't make you stronger than my dad. 8 simple words, but they had cut through Valeria's defenses sharper than any blade. She could handle fists. She could handle betrayal. But the innocence of a child seeing her, clearly seeing past her wealth and her reputation, that was unbearable. She grabbed a towel and pressed it to her face, though she wasn't sweating. She was trembling. Anger, shame, and something dangerously close to sorrow collided inside her. Across the gym, Marcus was kneeling by Emily, tying her shoelaces with the same steady patience he had shown in the Spar. He didn't gloat, didn't look her way, didn't seize the victory everyone knew he had earned. That indifference infuriated her most of all. Didn't he understand? To her, everything was a fight. To lose even slightly, even in perception, was to open the door to vultures who would never let her forget it. Boss, you want us to? One of her bikers. A hulking man with arms tattooed like road maps gestured toward Marcus. His tone implied rougher means of reclaiming her pride. Valeria snapped her head toward him, her glare sharp enough to slice steel. No. Her voice was low, tight, controlled. This isn't finished. She needed to reclaim control, not through her crew's intimidation, not through her money, but with her own two fists. She stormed across the floor, her boots clicking against the polished wood. The crowd quieted instinctively, sensing a storm building. She stopped a few feet from Marcus and Emily. Her eyes locked on Marcus, but her words carried for all to hear. "You think you've humiliated me?" she spat. "You think by holding back, by refusing to finish, you've proven some lesson?" She laughed bitterly, but it rang hollow. "You're nothing but a shadow of what you once were, and I will prove it. Here, in this room, in front of everyone." The silence was absolute. Witnesses, students, bikers, trainers watched with bated breath. They weren't just spectators anymore. They were jurors in a trial Valeria herself had set. Marcus stood slowly, his tall frame calm as ever. His eyes steady, unshaken, met hers without a flicker of malice. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Emily tugged at his sleeve, whispering something. But Marcus simply rested a hand on her shoulder, as if to say, "Patience." That infuriating calmness. That unshakable quiet. Valeria's heart pounded so hard, she thought it might crack her ribs. Rage and fear battled inside her, and under it all loneliness. The kind no sparring match could silence. Lena Torres, the assistant coach, stood near the back. She had been watching not only the spar, but Valeria herself, while others whispered in awe of Marcus. Lena's sharp eyes had caught something different. The way Valeria's bravado cracked in small moments, the way her threats sounded less like dominance and more like desperation. Now, with her phone discreetly in hand, Lena had begun to dig. A few searches, a few old military records, a name whispered on forums. Iron Will Hale. The more she read, the more her breath caught. Marcus Hale wasn't just a veteran. He was a legend. In certain circles, a man whose quiet presence had once turned tides in places most Americans never knew by name. And here he was, letting himself be mocked, letting himself be challenged, because he no longer fought for ego. He fought only when it mattered. Valeria's voice snapped Lena out of her thoughts. "I swear it!" Valeria declared, her voice rising to a near shout. "Before this is over, I will bring you down, Marcus Hale. I will prove that I am not to be pitied, not to be dismissed, not to be weaker than anyone." The words hung in the air like smoke. Somewhere in her tone was the fury of a billionaire unaccustomed to defeat. But beneath it, if one listened closely, was something else, the cry of a woman still wrestling with a wound that had never healed. The room stayed silent, not out of fear, but reverence. Witnesses felt the tremor of something deeper than a sparring match. They were seeing two lives collide, one built on humility, the other on scars. And no one knew yet who would break first. Valeria's fists trembled. She turned sharply, shoving her way through her crew, disappearing toward the locker rooms, her vow lingering like thunder after lightning. Marcus exhaled slowly, his hand still resting on Emily's shoulder, and Lena, phone glowing faintly in her palm, whispered the name she had just uncovered, Iron Will Hale. The air in the training hall was heavy with unshed words, the kind of silence that pressed down on the chest and made every heartbeat sound like a drum. Valeria Cross stood in the center of the mat, fists clenched her jaw, locked in defiance. Sweat gleamed on her temples beneath the neon lights, but her eyes burned with a fire that refused to dim. Marcus Hale, calm as a stone in a river, remained opposite her. He hadn't moved aggressively once. Not a strike, not a blow. Yet somehow he had shaken the room more than her whirlwind kicks and biker gang bravado ever could. And then Lena Torres rose from the edge of the crowd. She had been quiet all this time, her phone in hand, her face caught between awe and urgency. Now she stepped forward, her voice steady but resonant, carrying the weight of truth into the tense chamber. "I think you all should know who you're watching," she began, scrolling quickly, her eyes fixed on the words glowing back at her. "Marcus Hale, former United States Navy SEAL, call sign Iron Will." A ripple moved through the spectators. Shoulders stiffened, eyes widened. The murmurs swelled, shocked and electric. Lena continued, her tone unwavering. "He was more than just another SEAL. He trained combatives hand to hand and dominated the field. Navy records list him as undefeated in close-quarters sparring across multiple commands. He disappeared after a classified mission that no one would talk about. Some say he left because he couldn't stomach the politics. Others whisper he sacrificed more than we'll ever know." Every syllable fell like a hammer against stone. Valeria's bravado faltered for a flicker of a second. Her eyes darted to Marcus, searching for denial, for weakness, for anything. But Marcus didn't move. His silence was confirmation enough. His stillness screamed louder than any victory shout could. Gasps echoed around the gym. One man dropped his water bottle, the plastic clatter startling in the otherwise reverent quiet. A woman near the back crossed her arms tightly, as though holding herself together against the sudden gravity of who stood before them. "Marcus Hale isn't just a janitor or some washed-up veteran." Lena pressed on her voice now, threaded with emotion. "He's Iron Will, the man who trained others to survive, who carried missions no one else could. And you?" Her eyes flicked to Valeria. "You thought you were sparring with an ordinary man." Valeria bristled, her pride warring with the undeniable truth. She threw back her head with a sharp laugh, but it rang hollow, brittle. "So what if he's got some past glory that doesn't mean he's untouchable? Everyone bleeds, even Iron Will." But her voice cracked on the last word, betraying the storm brewing beneath her armor. Marcus finally stirred. He didn't address the crowd, didn't even acknowledge the revelation. His gaze remained soft, steady, anchored on Valeria. "The past doesn't matter," he said, his tone low and deliberate. "What matters is what we choose to be right here, right now." The words should have soothed, but they only ignited Valeria's defiance further. To her, kindness sounded like condescension, humility like humiliation. Her knuckles whitened as she clenched her fists tighter. From the sidelines, Emily had been watching it all. Her small hands clasped in front of her, her wide eyes filled with something deeper than childlike wonder. She had always known her father carried stories he never spoke aloud, scars hidden beneath the calm. But to hear them named aloud, to see strangers gasp at what she had long intuited, was like watching a shadow step into the light. Her gaze drifted almost instinctively toward Lena, and there, in Lena's expression, Emily saw something that pierced her young heart: admiration. It wasn't the shallow awe people gave celebrities or fighters. It was respect, hushed and reverent, tinged with compassion. Lena's eyes lingered on Marcus, with a softness that betrayed both recognition and gratitude. Emily's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. She didn't say anything, but inside her chest bloomed a quiet seed, a seed of possibility, not for herself, but for her father. For years it had been just the two of them, a world carved out of resilience and unspoken tenderness. But maybe, just maybe, there was someone else who could see Marcus the way she did. Someone who could honor both his strength and his silence. Back on the mat, Valeria snapped her fingers sharply, pulling all eyes back to her. "I don't care if you were Iron Will," she spat. "I don't care if you trained armies or saved nations. You're standing here in front of me, and I'll prove to everyone that power isn't about titles or old battles. It's about who's left standing." Her words carried venom, but also a trembling edge of desperation. Beneath the fury there was fear. Fear of irrelevance, of being overshadowed, of being stripped of the armor she had forged out of steel and rebellion. The crowd felt it too. The room didn't just belong to a Spar anymore. It had become an arena of truth, a confrontation between two souls, scarred by different battles. And in the corner, unnoticed by most, Emily's quiet smile remained. She leaned slightly toward Lena, whispering in a voice barely above a breath. "He never fights to win. He fights so others don't have to." Lena's heart caught. She looked down at the little girl, stunned by the clarity in her tone, the depth in her words. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes. For a fleeting moment, she saw Marcus not just as Iron Will, not just as a man with a buried legend, but as a father whose strength extended far beyond fists and victories. And in that moment, the story shifted. Valeria might still fight. Pride might still demand its duel. But the room had already changed sides. The witness had spoken, and the truth had turned the tide. The gym smelled of leather sweat and electricity, the kind of electricity that had nothing to do with wires. It was the kind that curled through the air when pride was at stake, when a crowd leaned forward in their seats, waiting for something extraordinary or catastrophic to happen. Valeria stood across from Marcus, like a storm crouched on the horizon. Her chest rose and fell, with a predator's rhythm muscles twitching under tattooed skin, eyes wild with a fury she hadn't allowed herself to feel since childhood. This wasn't just sparring anymore, it was survival of identity. She roared and launched forward. The first strike came as a blur, an overhead right designed to crack through walls of defense. Marcus tilted just enough, the punch grazing past his ear, the wind of it lifting strands of his long hair. Before the audience could process, Valeria unleashed a storm of kicks and elbows, a relentless cascade of trained violence. She drove him backward, cornering him like a lion forcing prey against the edge of the cage. But Marcus was no prey. Every strike met something softer than resistance, an invisible current redirecting, absorbing, neutralizing. His hands moved like quiet rivers, guiding her fury into emptiness. His body shifted, never rushed, never frantic. Each dodge carried the ease of someone who understood storms so well that he no longer feared the thunder. Gasps scattered through the room. The bikers who had come to worship their leader watched with unsettled eyes. Their queen was giving everything she had, but her opponent, this quiet janitor, this man with calloused hands and a janitor's apron, stood unshaken, untouched. The witness effect thickened like fog. Even those who had mocked Marcus hours ago sat in silence, drawn into the unexplainable aura of mastery. His stillness said more than any shout of victory ever could. Emily clutched the edge of the bench. Her small hands trembled not with fear, but with a strange, solemn understanding. She had seen this before, not here, not in combat, but in the way her father fixed broken things. He never rushed, never pushed harder than he needed to. He simply guided the world back into place. Valeria's storm grew desperate. Sweat dripped from her brow muscles, straining breath, tearing from her chest. She spun, kicked, elbowed her tattoos, flashing like warning signs in the harsh gym light. The sound of her fury echoed off the walls. Marcus remained as calm as the eye of a hurricane. He absorbed her storm until there was nowhere left for her rage to go. She swung again, a vicious hook, and he parried it with the gentleness of a father brushing hair from his daughter's face. Emily's whisper barely broke the silence. "Daddy, it's enough." The words rippled through Marcus like a bell toll. He turned his head slightly, catching his daughter's wide, earnest eyes. Her voice, soft, pure without malice, was the voice that anchored him when shadows of war clawed at the edges of his sleep. It was the reminder of why he fought, and why he never fought longer than he had to. He sighed almost mournfully, and nodded once. Valeria lunged again, her body screaming defiance. In that moment, Marcus moved. Not with a strike, not with a crushing counter, but with a gesture so quiet it was louder than thunder. He stepped into her momentum, raised a single open palm, and touched her shoulder with the weight of a feather. The energy of her own fury betrayed her. The slightest redirection toppled her balance. Valeria gasped as her boot skidded against the mat. The room stretched into slow motion as she tipped, stumbled, then crashed onto her back. The sound wasn't violent. It was hollow, final like a drumbeat at the end of a march. Silence devoured the gym. Every breath held. Every whisper died. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to disappear. Valeria lay there, stunned, her chest heaving. Her eyes wide, disbelieving, searched the ceiling for an explanation that didn't exist. She had given everything, her strength, her speed, her anger, her pride, and she had been undone by a single, almost tender touch. Marcus didn't advance. He didn't raise his arms in triumph. He simply stepped back, lowering his hand, his face unreadable, yet touched with something close to sorrow. Emily rose slowly, tears brimming in her eyes. She wasn't crying for her father. She knew his power. She was crying for the woman who had just discovered hers wasn't enough. In that instant, the room understood something too big to put into words. Strength wasn't the loudest roar. It wasn't domination. It wasn't the storm. Real strength was quiet, until it was needed. A biker in the back swallowed hard. Another shifted uncomfortably. Their gazes flickered between their fallen leader and the man who hadn't even broken a sweat. Doubt slid through their ranks like a crack in glass. Lena pressed her hand over her heart, unable to look away. She had seen fighters, soldiers, champions. But what unfolded before her wasn't just skill, it was philosophy embodied in flesh and blood. Valeria finally rolled to her side, her pride bleeding through every labored breath. Her eyes, however, betrayed something deeper, the wound of recognition. She had chased power her entire life, built empires of intimidation, worn strength like armor. Yet a single act of humility had dismantled her in front of her tribe. And Marcus Hale Iron Will, the ghost from military legend, stood there with the gentleness of a man who had nothing left to prove. The silence cracked with the sound of Emily's small voice carrying through the gym like a prayer. See, Daddy didn't want to hurt her. He only wanted to stop the storm. The crowd exhaled as though the truth itself had been spoken aloud. Valeria pressed her palms against the mat, rising to her knees, every inch of her body screaming in protest. Her jaw clenched, fury and humiliation warring with the faint glimmer of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years' respect. But she masked it quickly. She couldn't let them see. Not yet. For now, the room remained frozen, watching the storm finally break. For a moment, no one moved. Valeria stayed on her knees, breath-ragged palms pressed to the mat, as if the ground itself had risen up to humble her. The fluorescent lights hummed above a thin silver wash on sweat-slick vinyl. Around the ring, the crowd seemed held by an unseen hand. Bikers with folded arms, gone slack. Students with mouths half open, the kind of silence that follows a thunderclap when the sky decides it has said enough. Marcus stepped forward. He didn't raise his arms or claim a victory. He simply extended a hand, steady, but unhurried. There was nothing performative about the gesture. It was the natural movement of a man whose reflex is to lift rather than press down. The witnesses inhaled in one unplanned chorus. Valeria stared at the offered hand as if it were a verdict. Pride flickered across her face, old hard defensive, then wavered under the heavier current of something she had not felt in years. Mercy. She reached up. His grip was warm and firm, the kind of strength that steadies, not dominates. As he helped her to her feet, she felt the whole room tilt, the axis of power turning with that simple contact. Marcus released her once she found her balance. He took a respectful step back, giving her space, honoring the boundary, even as the crowd leaned in. When he spoke, his voice was low, even the tide returning to shore. "True strength isn't making others fear you," he said. "It's making them feel respected." The line hung in the air like a bell note, resonant and impossible to mishear. Faces softened. A biker in the back dropped his gaze to his boots. A young trainee swallowed hard, as if something had lodged at the base of her throat. Even the neon seemed to hum more gently, as if the room itself was listening. Valeria held Marcus's eyes. There was no triumph in them, no heat, only a gravity that steadied her, that refused to take the final step her pride expected to crush, to gloat, to make a lesson of her. And that refusal more than any blow broke something old and brittle inside her. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Words so easy in the boardroom and on the bike failed her when asked to cross the distance between defeat and dignity. Small footsteps pattered against the mat. Emily had left the bench without fuss, her backpack still slung across one shoulder, a few colored pencils peeking like wildflowers. She stopped between them, head tilted up toward the woman who had tried to break her father, and found herself unbroken instead. The gym parted around her as if guided by an instinct, older than training. Make room for the truth when it chooses a small messenger. "You have a lot of money," Emily said, voice clear. But soft, each word a careful stone set in place. "But my dad has something you've never been able to buy. Respect." No one laughed. Not a smirk, not a scoff. The line landed like a prayer, simple, unadorned, undeniable. It folded the room into quiet reverence. A trainer pressed knuckles to his lips. One of Valeria's own riders blinked too fast, like a man surprised by dust that wasn't there. Valeria swallowed. The sentence felt like a key turning in a long-locked door, a child's hand on a rusted latch that adult hands had only rattled and cursed. She fought to steady her breath. Her gaze slipped from the girl to Marcus and back again, a triangle of realization tightening with each pass. Marcus knelt slightly, so he and Emily were level. "Thank you, kiddo," he murmured. The gratitude wasn't for the defense. It was for the clarity, for naming out loud what he would never claim for himself. Lena Torres stood just beyond the ropes, one hand pressed to her sternum, as if keeping her heart from spilling out. She had found the articles, the posts, the whispered moniker, Iron Will Hale. But it wasn't the legend that moved her now. It was the father who had declined to win at someone else's expense, who had offered a hand where the world expected a fist. Through a sudden prickle of tears, she found Emily looking at her. The child gave the smallest, surest nod, and Lena, startled, returned it a private acknowledgement between witnesses that they were seeing the same man. Valeria's breath steadied. She lifted her chin. Cheeks flushed, not with rage, but with the sting that sits just beneath an apology. The room, sensing the fragile bridge forming, stayed utterly still. She faltered, startled by the unfamiliar weight of humility on her tongue. "I mistook fear for strength, and noise for power. I've built a life to make sure I was never small again." Her voice thinned, but she held it. Marcus shook his head once gently. "You're not small," he said. "You're just tired of fighting the wrong enemy." Something behind Valeria's ribs loosened a knot she'd carried since the first headline branded her as a woman who lost. Tears welled uninvited, turning the neon into a smear of comet tails. She blinked hard, furious at the vulnerability, and yet unable to deny the relief that traveled with it. Emily took the last step, and with the solemnity of a tiny diplomat, offered her own hand. It was not the hand of a victor, not the hand of a child above an adult. It was a small, human bridge. Valeria stared at it for a heartbeat, then another. Slowly, she accepted. Emily's fingers were warm, sure. For a breath's length, the gym disappeared. There was no money, no mat, no crew, only the strange grace of being seen and not condemned. The witnesses felt the shift. Conversations that might have resumed did not. The calculations of power that had defined this space, sponsorships, reputations, pecking orders, wavered, receded. In their place stood a simpler arithmetic: courage plus kindness equals authority. Fear minus dignity equals nothing at all. One of the bikers, broad-shouldered ink throttling his biceps, cleared his throat, embarrassed by the sound of it. "Boss," he ventured. But the title sounded different now. Lighter, less weaponized. Valeria released Emily's hand and straightened. The tears did not vanish. She didn't chase them away. They trembled unshed along her lower lashes, bright as glass. She turned to her crew, then to the students, then finally back to Marcus. "I don't want your pity," she said, voice almost steady. "I want to learn what you know." A murmur rolled the room low, and wonder struck. Even Lena exhaled a small, astonished sound. Marcus glanced at Emily, as if asking permission from the person whose compass he trusted most. Emily nodded the kind of nod that says, "Yes, this is the road that goes forward." He looked back at Valeria. "Respect can't be taught in one lesson," he said. "But it can be practiced. Start by giving it. You'll find it waiting for you on the way back." Valeria held his gaze, then gave the smallest, fiercest nod of her life. The ripple through the crowd was not applause. No one dared to break the sanctity of the moment, but relief, maybe even gratitude. The story had turned on a hinge made of mercy. Emily stepped back to her father's side. Marcus's hand found her shoulder, a simple touch that said more than safety. We don't win by beating people. We win by becoming the kind of people others can lean on. The fluorescent hum returned, ordinary and domestic, almost tender after the storm. Someone exhaled. Someone else finally sat down. The gym, having held its breath, learned how to breathe again. Valeria wiped the corner of her eye with the back of her hand. There was steel in her spine, but it was different steel, now tempered, not brittle. She looked to her crew. "We're done for tonight," she said. And for once, there was no swagger in the command, only leadership. As the room began to unfreeze, Lena stepped closer to the ropes, eyes still bright. Tomorrow would bring consequences, explanations, next steps. But tonight belonged to the simple revolution that happens when strength chooses respect. From the doorway, the night waited like a promise, and inside the gym, a billionaire learned how to stand. The silence shattered like glass. For a heartbeat, the training hall was frozen in the aftermath of what had just happened. Valeria Cross. The indomitable lady biker billionaire, draped in leather and pride, was still on her knees, staring at the floor where Marcus had placed her. Her breath was ragged, her defiance cracked, and yet her body trembled more from the realization of defeat than from the impact of his single, effortless move. Around her, the biker gang men and women, who had once roared with loyalty, looked away, shifting uncomfortably. The same mouths that had cheered her swagger now tightened into uneasy silence. A few lowered their eyes. Others rubbed the backs of their necks, shame rising like heat in a crowded room. The students too felt the change. Hours earlier, Valeria had been the unchallenged sun in this universe, commanding attention with every move. Now the spotlight had shifted. It hovered over Marcus. Calm, quiet, unassuming Marcus, and the daughter who stood faithfully at his side. Then, like a crack in a dam, the first sound came, a single pair of hands clapping. It was hesitant, unsure, but quickly followed by another, and then another. Within seconds, the room was alive with applause, not for the humiliation of Valeria, but for the grace, humility, and control Marcus had shown. Valeria rose slowly, refusing Marcus's hand this time, but her eyes betrayed something raw. Not rage, not even humiliation, but confusion. A woman who had lived her entire life dictating fear suddenly found herself questioned by her own shadow. She pressed her lips together, jaw trembling, and without a word, turned on her heel. The doors of the gym slammed behind her, leaving a vacuum of energy in her wake. The biker gang didn't follow. A few shifted as if to go, but the weight of what they had witnessed kept them rooted. Their eyes flickered toward Marcus, toward the quiet authority that had dismantled their leader, without cruelty. In their silence was the birth of doubt, the beginning of something they couldn't yet name. Emily tugged gently at her father's sleeve. She didn't speak, but her eyes were wide with understanding. She had seen it too. The respect of strangers had shifted. For the first time, they looked at her father, not as the janitor who swept floors, but as the man who had once commanded storms. Marcus wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Come on, kiddo," he murmured softly, almost to himself. "Time to go home." They walked toward the exit, with the ease of people who had nothing left to prove. Emily glanced back, once catching the faces of students who were still clapping, still looking at her father, as though seeing him for the first time. She smiled faintly, a secret pride lighting her small features. And then wait! The voice rang out, cutting through the echoes. Lena Torres. The single mother, the trainer who had dared to read Marcus's past. Aloud, the woman who had studied him with eyes both professional and personal broke from the crowd and hurried after them. Her breath was quick, her face flushed, but her words were steady. "You can't just disappear again." Marcus paused, his hand on the doorframe. He turned his expression neutral, but his eyes carrying that depth she had glimpsed before oceans of history and pain held back behind calm shores. "Disappear?" he asked quietly. "Yes," Lena said, her voice trembling with urgency. "You think staying hidden is noble, that blending in is safer. But people saw what happened today. They saw you protect without violence, win without breaking someone. That kind of strength, it changes people. It makes them believe. And right now, people need someone like you more than ever." Her words hung in the air, not as flattery, but as truth. Emily tilted her head, studying Lena with the sharp intuition only children carried. She noticed the way Lena's eyes softened when they landed on her father, the admiration she tried to keep professional, but couldn't entirely hide. For a moment, Emily's lips curved into a knowing smile, small, private, mischievous. Marcus looked away, torn. He had lived years trying to bury the Navy SEAL, the fighter, the protector. He had tried to be only a father, to keep Emily's world free of the shadows that haunted him. Yet here stood a woman, fierce in her own right, daring him to step back into the light, not for glory, but for others. "Miss Torres," he said at last. his voice low. "I'm just a man, trying to raise his daughter." Lena held his gaze, her eyes unflinching. "Maybe. But sometimes the right man at the right moment is more than enough." The words struck him harder than any punch Valeria had thrown. Emily squeezed his hand. "Daddy," she whispered. So only he could hear she's right. For the first time that night, Marcus's composure cracked just slightly, not in his posture, but in the flicker of his eyes, the weight of old walls trembling. He gave Lena the faintest nod, an acknowledgement of her courage. The gym doors opened, letting in the cool night air. Marcus and Emily stepped out into the darkness, their silhouettes framed against the neon glow of the streetlights. Lena lingered at the doorway, watching them leave, a thought, echoing in her chest, that she dared not say aloud yet. This man could change everything. The applause inside had faded, but the silence they left behind was louder. For the students, for the bikers, for Valeria herself, the storm had passed. But for Marcus Hale and his daughter Emily, the real journey was only beginning. The penthouse was silent, its vast glass walls staring out over the city like unblinking eyes. Neon from the streets below flickered against steel beams and velvet drapes. But Valeria Cross felt none of the power those lights usually stirred in her. She stood barefoot, the roar of last night's sparring still echoing in her bones. Every movement of her shoulder reminded her of the gentle but undeniable touch that had sent her crashing to the mat. Marcus Hale's restrained hand, a whisper of force that carried the weight of a lifetime's discipline. Her biker jacket, the symbol of her dominance, lay crumpled on the floor. She ran her fingers along her forearm, where faint scars told old stories. Knife fights, broken bottles, nights when survival demanded brutality. Scars she had once worn as trophies now looked like tally marks of emptiness. For the first time in years, the silence did not feel like power. It felt like judgment. She poured herself a drink, but let it sit untouched on the marble counter. In the mirror above the bar, she caught her reflection. Eyes-rimmed red mascara smudged from a tear she refused to admit had fallen. She almost didn't hear the soft rustle of paper against the door. A white envelope. No stamp, no sign, just her name scrawled in careful looping handwriting. Childlike, but steady. Valeria hesitated, then tore it open. The letter was written in blue ink, each word pressed deeply into the page, as though the writer wanted to leave a permanent impression. Dear Ms. Valeria, I don't know why you fight so hard to make people fear you. My dad says fear is cheap, but respect you have to earn every day. He tells me respect is the only belt that matters. I hope one day you'll understand. Maybe then you won't feel so alone. Emily. The paper trembled slightly in Valeria's hand. She read it once, then again. Each time the words cut deeper than any blade ever had. Respect is the only belt that matters. She sank into the leather couch, the city lights stretching endlessly behind her. She thought of her gang. Those men who looked to her as a queen, but feared her more than they followed her. She thought of the silence that had fallen in the gym, the disbelief when she was touched not with violence, but with mercy. She thought of Emily, that child's fearless eyes shining with a truth Valeria had never dared to speak aloud. Her breath hitched. She clenched the letter, then carefully smoothed it flat again, as if it were too fragile to bear her shame. That little girl's handwriting became more than words. It became a mirror, showing Valeria a version of herself she had long buried, a teenager who once rode not for power, but for freedom. Before the scars, before the chains of reputation. Valeria pressed the letter to her chest, staring out into the night. For the first time, she wondered if the empire she had built was nothing more than a fortress of fear, one kick away from collapse. The envelope sat on the table, its edges glowing under the city's neon wash. A simple scrap of paper, but already something more. A seed. And deep inside, Valeria Cross, beneath the steel and tattoos, something cracked open. Not weakness, not defeat. Something far rarer. The faint beginning of change. 3 months had passed since the night that shook the gym. Time, relentless and impartial, had turned whispers of that fateful Spar into legend. Yet what mattered more than the story was what it left behind, the cracks it carved into hardened hearts and the light that slipped through. Valeria Cross's empire looked no different from the outside gleaming bikes, roaring engines, contracts inked in glass offices. But she herself was not the same. The woman who once equated strength with fear now sat in her penthouse, with walls of glass, gazing out at the city lights, as though they held secrets. Her reflection in the window was not the ruthless biker billionaire the tabloids worshipped. It was a woman stripped of certainty. On her desk lay an object far humbler than her diamond-studded watch or platinum trophies, a folded piece of paper with handwriting in a child's uneven but heartfelt script. Emily's letter. I hope one day you'll understand. My dad always says respect is the only belt that matters. Valeria had read those words so many times she could trace the indentation of Emily's pen on the page. They had rooted themselves in her quiet, stubborn, unrelenting like seeds sprouting through cracks of concrete. And so, against every instinct that had once defined her, Valeria did something unthinkable. She opened her doors. Not to new investors or business moguls, but to children. She funded a martial arts scholarship for kids who could never afford lessons. Every month, the gym now echoed with laughter, squeaky sneakers, and the awkward but brave punches of children who carried scars far deeper than bruises. The once rowdy biker hangout had transformed. Posters of intimidation were replaced by banners with a simple creed: strength with respect. Where harsh commands once reigned, encouragement now bloomed. And at the center of this transformation was a surprising invitation. Marcus Hale. He returned not as a janitor with a mop in hand, but as a guest of honor, greeted by bows and grateful nods. His presence carried the quiet gravity of someone who had seen battlefields both external and within. Emily skipped by his side, her white dress a stark symbol of innocence amidst leather jackets and heavy bags. The moment Marcus and Valeria met again was heavy with unspoken history. She approached, her leather boots tapping against the polished floor, but her posture no longer dripped arrogance. There was hesitation, vulnerability, even humility in her eyes. "Marcus," she said, voice lower, steadier, almost reverent. "You taught me something I didn't think possible. You taught me that money buys fear, but it can never buy respect." Marcus studied her quietly. He didn't smirk or gloat. Instead, he nodded once as if to say, "Then you've learned the most expensive lesson of all." Emily, sensing the delicate gravity of the moment, stepped forward. "We're glad you changed things, Miss Cross. Kids need a place where they feel safe and respected." For the first time, Valeria's lips curved into a smile, not sharpened by mockery, but softened by gratitude. She knelt, slightly lowering her gaze to Emily's level. "It was your letter, Emily. You cracked something open in me. I didn't expect a child to be my teacher, but here we are." Emily giggled, hiding behind Marcus's arm, but her eyes shone with pride. Across the gym, Lena Torres watched. She had witnessed this transformation with quiet wonder, helping to coach the children, smoothing rough edges where Valeria's reforms had stumbled. Yet now, As she watched Marcus, something stirred deeper than admiration. After the crowd dispersed, Lena approached him. She carried herself with the easy grace of a woman both strong and tender. Her brown hair tied back a thin sheen of sweat on her forehead from hours of training. "You do realize what you've done here, don't you?" she said. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Mopped a few floors with my fists." She laughed, soft and genuine. "Oh, you reminded a woman who had everything that she was missing, the one thing that mattered. And you reminded all of us that humility is not weakness." Her words lingered longer than she expected. Marcus, a man who so often chose silence over small talk, didn't deflect. Instead, he looked at her for a beat too long. Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement, a recognition of souls carrying burdens, yet finding solace in each other's presence. Emily noticed, of course. Children always did. She tugged at Marcus's sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered loudly enough for Lena to hear, "you're smiling. You don't smile like that often." Marcus cleared his throat embarrassed, while Lena tried and failed to hide a blush. The moment was fragile, unpolished, yet warm, like the first glow of dawn after a long night. That evening, as the gym emptied and the city hummed outside, Marcus, Emily, Valeria, and Lena lingered. The air smelled of chalk sweat and something new hope. Valeria extended her hand once more, but this time not in challenge, not in pride. Simply in gratitude. "You saved me from myself," she admitted. Marcus shook her hand firmly, his words quiet, but steady. "No, you saved yourself. You just needed someone to remind you of who you could be." For the first time in years, Valeria felt lighter. The scars on her knuckles, the trophies in her cabinets, none of it mattered compared to the respect she was beginning to earn, not through dominance, but through giving. And Marcus, though still the same man who carried shadows in his silence, found himself stepping, however cautiously, into the light. Not just for the world, but for himself, for Emily, and maybe, just maybe, for the woman named Lena Torres, who had begun to see him not as a ghost of war, but as a man of grace. The room, once a battleground, now felt almost sacred. A place where broken people, whether billionaires, veterans, or children, could begin to heal. The community center's hall was filled with the sound of laughter, the rustle of folding chairs, and the innocent chatter of children who had never dreamed they would be here. A banner stretched across the stage scholarship ceremony, "Future through Discipline." The same gym that once vibrated with arrogance and rivalry now breathed with hope. Rows of children, many in worn-out sneakers and oversized hand-me-down uniforms, sat in the front. Behind them were parents with tired eyes, but luminous pride. And at the center of it all, Valeria Cross, no longer clad in leather and chains, but in a simple, elegant suit. The tattoos still marked her arms, but today they looked less like emblems of rebellion and more like scars of a past she had finally learned to honor rather than glorify. She stood at the podium, her usually defiant voice trembling. 3 months ago, she began, "I thought strength was about domination, about making others kneel so you could rise. But I was wrong." Her eyes swept over the crowd, but her gaze faltered, landing for a moment on Marcus and Emily, who stood quietly in the back. Marcus, his posture humble as always, wore a plain button-down shirt. Emily, in her simple white dress, clutched a notebook to her chest, her eyes shining with the calm wisdom of a child far beyond her years. Valeria swallowed hard and continued. "The greatest strength is not in the fists we throw or the trophies we buy. It's in the humility to learn to change and to lift others when they cannot lift themselves." Her voice cracked, and to her own surprise, tears followed. For a woman who once mocked weakness, crying in front of hundreds felt like standing naked. But she didn't turn away. She let the tears flow. "These scholarships are not charity," she said, regaining a thread of steadiness. "They are proof that every one of you, every child here, deserves a chance to rise with dignity. Because—" She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than any shout. "Respect is the only belt that matters." The hall erupted into applause. The children clapped wildly, parents wiped their eyes, and even the toughest bikers at the edges of the room bowed their heads, as if humbled by the sound of truth. From the back, Marcus did not move. He didn't bask in the applause or nod in self-congratulation. Instead, he placed a steady hand on Emily's shoulder. She looked up at him, smiling with that gentle confidence that had stunned Valeria weeks before. "Dad," Emily whispered. "She used your words." Marcus allowed himself the faintest smile. "No, kiddo," he murmured. "She made them her own." When the ceremony ended, children lined up to receive their scholarships. Some clutched brand new belts, others held simple envelopes, with the funds that would allow them to train to learn to believe in themselves. For the first time, the room felt like a sanctuary, not an arena. Valeria stepped down from the stage, her composure still fragile, but her resolve strong. She walked toward the back, where Marcus and Emily waited, away from the spotlight, exactly where they always preferred to be. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then Valeria spoke, her voice low and sincere. "You gave me something I never thought I'd need, humility." She turned to Emily. "And you, little one, you reminded me that respect doesn't come from fear, but from truth." Emily's smile was small, but radiant, as if she already knew this moment would come. She simply nodded and handed Valeria a folded piece of paper. The first letter she had written weeks ago now returned, but with a new note scribbled on the bottom in Valeria's unmistakable handwriting. "I understand now. Thank you." Marcus inclined his head slightly. His version of acceptance. He didn't need speeches or grand gestures. The transformation before him was enough. Lena appeared beside them, her presence like a soft current in a storm. She glanced at Marcus with warmth that held no demand, only patience. Their eyes met briefly. Two souls recognizing that something gentle had begun to grow between them, tender as a seed, but strong enough to weather time. As the hall emptied, Valeria took one last look at the children bouncing with joy, at the parents embracing with tears at Marcus and Emily, standing like quiet pillars at the edge of the celebration. She whispered almost to herself, "The room shook that day, Marcus, not because of fists, but because of truth." Marcus finally looked her in the eyes, his voice calm, steady, carrying the weight of every battle, every scar, every lesson life had branded into him. "Respect," he said softly, so that only she and Emily and Lena could hear, "is the only belt that matters." The camera of memory seemed to freeze the image, the tear-streaked billionaire, the quiet veteran, the wise child, and the waiting world. The applause faded, replaced by music swelling in the background, warm and healing, like the sound of dawn breaking after a long night. And with that, the story did not end, but opened into something larger, an afterglow of justice, humility, and hope. Fade out. Fade. Before you go, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Share it in the comments. It's always a joy to see how far these stories travel. And if this story touched you, consider subscribing to Soul Moment Story so you won't miss the next journey we share. From my heart to yours. Thank you for spending your precious time with us today. Until next time, take care and keep hope alive.